I hadn't seen Evan in years. My sister had moved to the West Coast with her family when he was still a teenager, and the last time I'd seen him, he was all gangly limbs and awkward smiles. But when he showed up at my doorstep, bags in hand and a few days' worth of stubble on his face, I barely recognized him. He had grown up, a lot. His once boyish features had sharpened, his frame filled out, and the air of confidence that came with adulthood clung to him in a way that caught me off guard. "Hey, Aunt Claire," he said, giving me that smile I remembered so well, only now it seemed different, deeper somehow. I blinked, trying to mask my surprise. "Evan, look at you," I said, pulling him into a hug. "It's been way too long." He smelled like cologne and fresh air, and I had to remind myself that he was family. My sister's son. But something about him now made me feel a bit off balance. I chalked it up to the surprise of seeing him all grown up. He'd come to stay with me for a few days while he sorted out a new job in the city. It was temporary, I told myself, just family helping family. The first couple of days passed easily enough. We fell into a comfortable routine. Evan was charming, easy to talk to, and funny in that dry way I had always appreciated. He made himself useful around the house, fixing little things I hadn't gotten around to yet, and I found myself enjoying his company more than I expected. But it wasn't long before I noticed the tension. It was subtle at first. Maybe it was the way he looked at me when we talked, his eyes lingering a little too long, or how I'd catch him glancing my way when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I told myself I was imagining things, but the more time we spent together, the more I felt it. One night, we were sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in my hand, talking about everything and nothing at all. The conversation flowed easily like it always had, but this time there was something different underneath it. I was hyper-aware of every little thing, how close we were sitting, the way his leg brushed mine when he shifted in his seat, how his voice lowered when he spoke to me. I could feel my heart start to race, and I hated it. This was Evan, my nephew. But the air between us felt thick, charged with something I didn't want to name. I took a sip of wine, trying to steady myself, but when I looked up, Evan was watching me. His gaze was intense, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I cleared my throat, trying to break the moment. "So, you excited about the new job?" I asked, forcing a smile. He smiled back, but there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite place. "Yeah, I am, but honestly, I've been enjoying just being here, with you." I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, and I looked away, pretending to focus on the glass in my hand. "Well, it's been nice having you," I said, my voice sounding a little too casual, even to my own ears. The silence that followed was heavy, and I could feel him watching me, waiting for something. I wasn't sure what. I shifted on the couch, putting a little more distance between us, but it didn't help. The tension was still there, buzzing beneath the surface. I knew I should say something, anything, to lighten the mood, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I stood up, feeling the need to escape the charged atmosphere of the room. "I think I'm going to call it a night," I said, my voice a little too bright. Evan looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, sure. Good night, Aunt Claire." I nodded, barely meeting his eyes, and hurried up the stairs to my room. Once I was alone, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hands were shaking, and I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. What had I been thinking? This was ridiculous. I was imagining things, reading into innocent moments that didn't mean anything. But as I lay in bed that night, the image of Evan's intense gaze stayed with me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. The next morning, I woke up hoping the strange tension from the night before had dissipated. Maybe it was just the wine or my overactive imagination, I told myself. I'd blown it out of proportion. But as soon as I walked downstairs and saw Evan making coffee in the kitchen, the uneasiness returned. He greeted me with a warm smile, as if nothing had changed, but I felt it again, the same charge lingering between us. I tried to shake it off, to ignore how his eyes followed me when I moved around the kitchen. We made small talk over breakfast, and I kept reminding myself that this was normal, family, just a nephew staying with his aunt. But as the day went on, I couldn't help but notice how easily we fell into a rhythm that felt too comfortable. We spent most of the afternoon together, chatting, laughing, and it felt so natural that I almost forgot about the tension. Almost. Until I caught him looking at me, the same way he had the night before, with that unspoken something between us. By evening, I was on edge again. We were sitting on the back patio after dinner, the sun just beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the yard. Evan had poured us both a drink, and as we sat in the fading light, I couldn't help but notice how the conversation kept drifting toward more personal topics. He asked me about my life, my marriage, how things had changed for me over the years. I felt a knot tighten in my chest as I answered his questions, trying to keep things light, but there was a heaviness behind his words. He was watching me closely, listening carefully, and I could feel the walls I'd built between us slowly crumbling. It was dangerous, and I knew it, but I couldn't seem to stop it. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes lingering on mine in a way that made my heart pound. "You know," he said softly, "I always thought you were different from other people in the family, more understanding." I smiled, trying to play it off as a casual compliment. "Thanks, I guess." But he didn't smile back. He just looked at me, his expression serious, his eyes intense. "No, I mean it. You've always been special to me, more than just family." My breath caught in my throat and I looked away, suddenly unsure of where this conversation was heading. I needed to get up, to walk away before things went too far, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. "I'm your aunt, Evan," I said softly, my voice faltering as I tried to remind myself and him of the boundaries that should have been clear. "I know," he replied, just as softly, "but that doesn't change how I feel." I could feel my heart racing now, and I couldn't bring myself to look at him. This was crossing a line I didn't want to cross, but the pull between us was undeniable, and I hated myself for not ending it sooner. I hated how part of me wanted to hear what he would say next, how part of me wanted to feel whatever this was between us. The silence between us stretched out, thick with tension. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the deck as I pushed it back. "I think we've had enough to drink," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but I knew it wavered. I turned to go inside, needing to put some distance between us. "Claire." His voice stopped me in my tracks, soft but insistent, like he was asking me to stay, to not walk away from whatever this was. I stood there, frozen for a moment, my back to him, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to have. Every instinct told me to keep walking, to go inside and put an end to this. But I didn't move. Instead, I closed my eyes, my hands trembling at my sides. "Good night, Evan," I said quietly, my voice barely more than a whisper, and I forced myself to walk inside, closing the door softly behind me. As soon as I was inside, I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what had almost happened, how close I had come to crossing a line I couldn't uncross. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the conversation with Evan over and over again. I kept hearing his words, the softness in his voice when he said I was more than just family to him. It was wrong, so wrong, and yet I couldn't deny the flutter in my chest every time I thought about it. Every rational part of me screamed to let it go, to move on, but something had shifted, and I knew things wouldn't go back to normal. The next morning I woke up determined to create some distance. I told myself that today would be different. I would be firm, put some boundaries in place, and remind Evan and myself that this was a line we couldn't cross. I couldn't risk letting anything else happen. But when I walked into the kitchen, the air felt different. He was there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. And when he looked up at me, I could see the same tension from the night before lingering between us. "Morning," he said, his voice low, almost cautious. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral as I poured myself a cup of coffee. I avoided looking directly at him, hoping that if I kept things casual, it would put some space between us. But as I sat down, the silence felt heavy. He was watching me again, and I could feel it like a weight pressing down on my chest. I tried to make small talk, asked him about his plans for the day, but the conversation felt strained. Every word felt loaded, like we were both tiptoeing around the real issue. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, pretending I had things to do around the house. "I think I'll head out for a bit," I said, grabbing my keys. "Run a few errands." Evan stood up too, his movements slow and deliberate. "Do you need any help?" he asked, his voice quiet, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my stomach flip. "No," I said quickly. "I'm fine. I'll be back in a little while." I practically fled out the door, my heart pounding as I got into the car and drove aimlessly for a while. I just needed to clear my head, to get some space. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the way I felt. It was like a storm had settled inside me, pulling me in two directions: what was right and what I wanted. After a couple of hours, I found myself driving back home. I had hoped that some time away would give me clarity, but I still felt just as conflicted. When I walked into the house, I found Evan in the living room, stretched out on the couch, looking almost too comfortable. The sight of him there, in my space, made my pulse quicken again. "You're back," he said, sitting up as I entered the room. His eyes were on me, and I could feel that same pull between us, the one I had been trying so hard to resist. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual, but the tension in the room was palpable. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend that nothing was happening. I sat down on the armchair across from him, trying to keep some physical distance between us, but it didn't help. The silence stretched out between us, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, I couldn't take it any longer. "Evan, we need to talk," I said, my voice barely steady. He looked at me, his expression serious. "I know." I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "Whatever this is, it can't happen. You know that, right?" He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name: longing, regret, maybe both. "I know," he said softly, "but that doesn't change how I feel." His words hung in the air, and I felt my heart race again. This was dangerous. We were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't come back from, and I needed to put a stop to it. But as I looked at him, sitting there with that same intense gaze, I felt myself wavering. "I care about you," I said quietly, my voice trembling. "But this, we can't. We shouldn't." Evan stood up, slowly crossing the room until he was standing in front of me. My breath caught in my throat as he reached out, his hand gently brushing against my arm. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how much I wanted more. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if he was struggling with it just as much as I was. For a moment we stood there, inches apart, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I could feel the pull, stronger than ever, and I knew that if I didn't stop it now, things would spiral out of control. My mind screamed for me to walk away, but my body stayed rooted to the spot, caught up in the moment. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, I stepped back, breaking the spell. "This isn't right," I said, my voice firmer this time. "We can't do this." Evan looked at me, his face full of frustration and something that looked like hurt, but he didn't push. He just nodded, his eyes still locked on mine. "I'm sorry," I whispered, feeling the weight of my words, but knowing they were necessary. I can't." Without another word, I turned and walked upstairs to my room, my heart pounding in my chest. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it, as I tried to catch my breath. The tension between us had reached its peak, but I knew I had made the right choice. I had stopped it before it went too far, but even as I sat there in the quiet of my room, I couldn't shake the feeling of his touch lingering on my skin, and I knew, deep down, that things would never be the same between us again. Since you enjoyed this video, click on the subscribe button on the screen and check out our channel for more videos like this.